Good morning. I'm Richard Fafara. I'd like to welcome you to panel session number 6, which will primarily be focused on AI. We're fortunate this morning in having 2 excellent speakers. The first will be Marvin Pelaez from the Adler Aquinas Institute, who will talk about Boethius and AI. And our second speaker, Robert Kohn, who's a fellow from the Center for the Study of the Great Ideas and a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School, will talk about safe machine intelligence through law. We look forward to these presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. It's great to be here again. I love these conferences, especially you have academics, you have business people, you have government people. We're all interested in the same thing. This year's theme is very important, and now having been in the second day of this conference, I've learned a lot from the other papers. I want to quote Yogi Berra after I've heard everything concerning AI. Yogi Berra once said, "Prediction is a difficult thing, especially about the future." Okay. So I want to discuss the economic impact of AI on the labor economy. As you are well aware, there's been much discussion about AI displacing workers. This is not far-fetched. We encounter job displacement by AI all the time. Think of the customer service representatives. Think of cashiers at Walmart. When you walk into the supermarkets now, you notice less and less cashiers and more self-checkout stations. AI has touched almost every aspect of society. We have grown accustomed to Siri and Alexa. Okay. Since the spirit of this conference is to look forward, I want to talk about specifically industrial robots. So AI within the industrial robots and their impact on the labor force. Okay. Industrial robots are automatically controlled, reprogrammable, and multi-purpose machines, which means that they do not need a human operator, just to give a definition. Okay. Many feasibility studies have been conducted on the impact of industrial robots in recent years. In general, they all address the concern on what will happen to jobs as workers are substituted with robots. Okay. To answer this question, empirical studies have been conducted to estimate this impact. Okay. Before sharing the results of one particular study, let's contextualize the current state of affairs regarding the labor force participation rate right now. As of last month, the current labor force participation rate is about 62.7%. A couple of years ago, there was a scholar here by the name of Peter Simpson who asked me, what does that mean? 62.7%. So I don't want to get into the numbers, but I'll tell you that the labor force participation rate, the way the government measures it, it includes only the non-institutional labor participation. So say we have 300 million people in the country, minus the people that are in the military, minus the people that are in the nursing homes, minus the people that are in corrections facilities, and then you get a number like 257 million. And out of those 257 million, you count the people that are employed and the people that aren't employed, but only those people that are looking for work within a 4-week period. You take those numbers, comes out to about 161,000, both the employed and the unemployed. You divide by 161 million, you divide it by 257 million, you get the labor force participation rate. Of course, there are other measures of labor force participation rate, and then you would have to contact the government. It's published on the website if you want to find out, well, what if someone's looking for work, like say within 15 weeks, 20 weeks, okay? So this is important to know. The unemployment rate is about 3.75%, okay? Why do we need to know these numbers? In 1980, the civilian labor force was about 100 million. Okay, and the annual sales of robots at that time in the US was about 10,000. So you had 100 million, you had 10,000. Okay, now what percentage of the labor force was that at that time? 0.01%. Okay, in 2016, the civilian labor force increased to 158 million. Okay, so it's 34 years later. 58 million more workers, right? So then the number of robot sales to the United States was 31,400,000. Okay, so when you try to look at things in context, there's something interesting here, which is why we're discussing this at this conference. The number of robot sales are accelerating, right? The number of robot sales is accelerating, but overall, since 2016, the number of industrial robots compared to the actual labor force participation rate is about 0.19%. Okay? So we're seeing increasing in the sales of robots. As the cost of technology decreases throughout time, the sales will even be more accelerated. Okay? Artificial intelligence is used in the following industry worldwide. And I've heard some mention of this in Peter DeMarco's presentation. Automobile industry, 39%. That's the largest. The next is electrical and electronics, 19%. Then you have metals, 9%, and chemical, rubber, and plastics at 9%. The electrical and electronics industry includes computers, radio, TV, communication devices, medical equipment, precision optical instruments. They are considered the main drivers of AI, not necessarily the industrial robots. Okay? According to a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, published in 2017, economists Acemoglu and Restrepo suggest that the use of industrial robots may reduce employment and wages in the U.S. economy. Okay? This is but one interesting empirical paper, but as mentioned, I am confident that these economists have formulated a sophisticated model to base their claim. What is being contested, more broadly, is whether that old economic theory still stands, that as productivity increases, so do jobs. Does employment growth? Do we have employment growth? Does that increase? And so does income. This is what's being contested. This theory has held up for the most part in previous industrial revolutions. And I say revolutions, I emphasize that because we've had several. We began to see this during the medieval era, but the most famous one that everyone talks about occurred in 1750, where you really had the acceleration of technology. However, according to the Economist magazine, this new era of automation, enabled by more powerful and capable computers, could work out differently. What does that mean? We are not all on the same page as far as employment growth, and if income would rise or remain the same, or even fall, or even decrease. To sum up the current state of affairs with regard to AI and industrial robots, AI is already pretty advanced, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence from our own experiences that attest to this. Number two, we know that the stock of industrial robots worldwide in the US and its impact on the labor market. So we can do some analysis, okay? And number three, economists analyze economic activity in the short and long run time periods, okay? So we know pretty much that in the short run, there's going to be some displacement of workers, okay? We're just not absolutely sure about the long run. I'll talk about the manual jobs, of course, but manual jobs, which is a specific category of jobs. But we're not sure about jobs in general, okay? So then here's the question. How bleak is this situation, okay? Speculations abound ad nauseum, okay? Many throughout history have worried about such prospects, and I don't think that we will see any guiding wisdom until this situation becomes very bleak. One such person, an economist named John Maynard Keynes, in an essay written in 1930, wrote the following. The title of the essay was Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, essay 1930, and he writes, "We are being afflicted with a new disease, of which some readers may not have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in years to come, namely technological unemployment." Okay, this means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. Okay. I once heard was a former Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich. So I was still working for the government under Robert Reich. And he had a meeting in front of Google. So I'm not on official duty, so I can mention the names. This is on YouTube. And he suggested that as people start becoming more displaced from their work because of these industrial robots, he suggested that the government, there's not going to be any increase in income. In fact, there's going to be some jobs, but they're going to be lower paid jobs. He suggested that the government subsidize people for their income while they stay home. Okay, so there. Last year, other people suggested we increase entrepreneurial activity. Last year in this conference, we honored the late Michael Novak, who articulated a democratic capitalism, not the hyper-capitalism that many associate with, with this system, but an attenuated capitalism in which the kaput, right, is understood as the essential element in capitalism. In a well-functioning free economy, where all of its various parts work harmoniously for the common good or the whole, technology is one of the factors of production, and it bears upon creating wealth by increasing productivity. Will there be employment growth given productivity gains? The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that the labor force participation rate will grow till 2024, which is not that far away, but it will grow slowly. So obviously there is an impact. The Bureau cannot make projections and only can tell you what the state is, the state of the economy is, but there's literature that from where we have it now, 62.7, it's not going to decrease. It'll stay the same or increase. Okay, this remains to be seen. Indeed. Okay, not because of any denials of the capabilities of the AI, but because of the reticence at best and denial at worst will lead us into a direction feared by those who think that the robots will take over. Now that scenario sounds pretty bleak to me if that were the case, but we will have to look at the situation from a philosophical point of view. I like to use the framework that was offered to us by John Paul II in his Fides et Ratio. It always has helped me out when that encyclical came out. So we have to look at what truth is from the scientific level, right? There is the small t. Then that's where you have all those scientists that are inventing this AI and whatnot. We've been talking a little bit about this. But then they have to turn to the philosophers to find out, well, what do we do with this technology? And I'm glad we're having this conference because I was wondering if we were invited to even discuss this. Okay, so and then when the philosophers went out of questions, then the highest level of truth, according to John Paul II, is religion. We look towards religion. We've had some discussion of this, some religious points brought up here too with regard to where does God play into this? Okay, modern science, when done properly, offers the lowest mode of truth. Religion offers the highest, and philosophy somewhere in the middle, aiding both modes of truth at the polar ends while coming up with its own truths. Okay. Now, I think right now we're going to turn to a philosopher, which is what the title of my paper is based on. This gentleman's name was Boethius. And I feel that we're at a stage of a Boethian renewal because of the following. He was an extraordinary man, and I don't think he gets much attention as other ancient and medieval philosophers. Boethius was the hinge between the ancient and medieval worlds. He was a public servant. He was a Catholic. He was a philosopher. He was considered to be the last Roman, the father of scholasticism, and yes, a transmitter of Aristotle's logical works. In addition, he wrote another important work called The Consolation of Philosophy, and also work De Trinitate, in which St. Thomas Aquinas, commented on it, and has also been cited in the previous papers in this conference. I want to make the following analogy between the current focus of industrial robots and the time in which Boethius lived. Okay, historians debate when the Middle Ages began. Some claim that Boethius was a medieval man. Others claim that, you know, he was part of the ancient world. I lean towards that he was part of late antiquity. It was a transitionary period. Okay, but either way, it's indisputable that Boethius saw himself on the threshold of the change between two worlds. According to Joseph Pieper, Boethius knew that the work in which he had grown to manhood was doomed. Okay, and that the world was the world coming into being was not of his own, although he turned passionately towards it. So he embraced it. And what was the evidence of this viewpoint? The works that he translated into Latin, the available works at that time, Aristotle's work. He felt himself as passing on the baton of ancient learning to the new world ahead. So this was his mission. Likewise, we are on that threshold of change. Okay, once again, with respect to the prospect of industrial robots displacing workers. Okay, now we are on the digital economy. We have had such concerns in previous industrial revolutions. We can ask the question, will there be less manual job occupations? And I think so. I think that has happened already. So there is this trepidation about the future of jobs, but we have to take a little closer look at it. Similarly, Boethius experienced trepidation about the intellectual culture that he knew and enjoyed, more so because he spent his whole life in what Joseph Pieper terms as an occupied territory. So then Rome was under the rule of the Germans. Okay. When contemplating the end of your life, a certain wisdom emerges. We see this in the epistles of St. Paul and certainly in Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy. This was truly a bleak situation for him when you're in a prison cell waiting to get executed. I think we are, as a society, are past the point where the human person was executed, and we have to conduct a post-mortem and revive that human person. Similarly, it seems that this understanding of the human person has been put on trial and convicted and placed in prison. Okay. The prevailing understanding is that which compares man's physical abilities, even his intellectual abilities, to compare with AI, to that of machines. And this is the cause of the worry. This is why I say we're on the cusp of a Boethian renewal. Boethius had an additional fear as he was waiting for his execution. I contend that there was an analogical relationship between that fear and the capabilities of AI and industrial robots. In fact, we've been talking a lot about some people having fear, especially in this conference and the polling. Okay. As we know, Boethius seeks the counsel of Lady Philosophy to console his grief. I attribute the death of the human person in both of these events, the primary analog. However, I think Lady Philosophy is still with us and has always been, and now more than ever, and she will appear to console us, regarding AI. So while in prison, Lady Philosophy addresses Boethius' grief. She reminds him that there are, open quote, certain basic truths which place his misfortunes in proper perspective. She asks them, and now I read from a translation. How then, she went on, is it possible that you can know the origin of all things and still be ignorant of their purpose? But this is the usual result of anxiety. It can change a man, but it cannot break him and cannot destroy him. I want you to answer this too. Do you remember that you are a man? Boethius responds, how can I forget that? Lady Philosophy then asks, well then, what is a man? Can you give me a definition? And Boethius responds, do you mean that I am a rational animal and mortal? I know that, and I admit that I am such a creature. Society today makes the mistake of focusing on robots and not the human person, which is the thesis of this paper. We have been conditioned to look at the human person as just a factor of production and economics. in addition to land and capital. If you compare the human's productive capacity to that of a robot, people unfortunately espouse a doom and gloom of the workers. Of course, studies have been conducted for this. You compare the labor capacity of a human being and a robot, the robot's going to win. But isn't this the state of the world today? Isn't this the result of the mechanical thinking started by Descartes and his progeny? Okay. Boethius formulated his classical definition on the human person in prior years before his imprisonment, about 512. An individual substance of rational nature. His definition was adopted by St. Thomas Aquinas and was regarded classical by the medieval schools and has the approval of modern theologians. Several hundred years later, St. Thomas develops and expands upon Boethius' definition of the human person, a doctrine to be ignored today, okay, but very much the starting point for renewal. Thanks to Boethius, and yet again, another change in society, a paradigmatic change in society with the advent of AI. But how? How is this possible? Personally, I think AI is a blessing, okay, because it makes people feel uncomfortable and causes them to search for alternative solutions, okay? We have to pause and refocus our attention on the nature of the human person. This is why I think we are, once again, back to the place where Boethius was in his time. Okay. Now, it is not that society is not preparing for this shift. Some new jobs have emerged, supporting the economic theory that increased productivity stimulates employment growth. Here are some of those new jobs that have emerged in response to the digital economy. You've heard about the digital marketing specialist. You've heard about data analysts. You heard about the social media manager. You've heard about information security analysts, the cyber pros. Somebody mentioned here about cyber protection. Okay. Obviously, these new digital jobs require specialized technical training and continuous learning and creativity. Also, according to the Pew Research Center, employment growth has been most rapid in the occupations requiring higher social and analytical skills. The new analysis of employment data shows that the job categories with the highest growth tend to be higher social skills, analytical savvy, and technical prowess. Computer programmers, for example, require the ability to think logically and abstractly to code programming languages and formulating algorithms. There was an article in the Atlantic magazine entitled "How Aristotle Created the Computer." The philosophers that influenced the stage for the technical revolution and remade our world. The author was referring to the mathematical symbolic logic that developed in the 19th century by George Boole and Gottlieb Frege. Here's the difference, however. From what I mean by Boethian renewal, mathematical logic, although powerful in its efficiency, is a formal logic that manipulates mental symbols. Okay, traditional Aristotelian logic expresses insight into objective reality because it implicitly assumes metaphysical realism. AI and therefore industrial robots are programmed with these algorithms, with mathematical logic, and it's not based on metaphysical realism. Metaphysical realism contends that reality is intelligible and that it includes a real order, and that we as human persons are expressing a discovery of order, not a creation of order. Okay? According to Maurer, Father Maurer, Boethius rejected the Aristotelian doctrine of universals because he was a Platonist, and his work on the constellation of philosophy is a Platonist work. Specifically, Boethius adopted the Platonic doctrine of innate ideas. Nevertheless, Maurer says, Boethius' denial of the Aristotelian doctrine of universal was destined and stimulated this conversation with considerable influence in the medieval ages, and was later pondered and expounded upon in the 12th and 13th centuries, after the reintroduction of Aristotle's other works at that time. So what we have now before us is not only Boethius's doctrines, but also in the works of the 13th century, culminating in St. Thomas Aquinas, to help society today refocus on the nature and capabilities of the human person. his natural intelligence, to help assuage concerns on AI and industrial robots taking over jobs. What follows are suggestions on how to go about this. So this paper, I looked at it more like a policy paper, right? So I'm giving you some statistics. I am talking about some philosophy, but now I'm going to suggest what we can do, and then open it up to the floor later on when we have the question and answer period. The future philosophy is secure because it underlies all modern science, even though the world may not be aware of it. Now, the question is, what do we do? I have some proposals here for your consideration, and I think these proposals will help realize this Boethian renewal more fully. The first proposal, journalism. I see efforts already made towards this end in scholarly literature. And that is a great place to start and absolutely necessary for the advancement of perennial philosophy. But we can't hide a light under the bushel. Okay? The journal articles are not articles that are generally read by the public or the general reader. Okay? We must set it ablaze. Dr. Mortimer Adler did something like this with his own books. Okay? Just yesterday, we had a presentation with Jeffrey Martinell. He held up one of Dr. Adler's books, Aristotle for Everyone. Okay? Robert Delfino's most recent book, Does God Exist?, also contributes to that end. Okay, a few months ago, actually, Dr. Redpath did a couple of podcasts with the Catholic Cave, one on Ragamuffin Thomism and the other one on the state of philosophical studies in academia. Okay, but even with these efforts, I think we should engage society at a more popular level. Okay, like the mendicant orders that came out of the monasteries in the 13th century to share the gospel and teach Christian virtue. I'm likewise calling on the scholars to the same, analogically speaking, to come out of the universities, engage the public more directly. How? Scholars should do more journalism, in addition to publishing in scientific journals. Like Boethius' ideas that were transmitted and pondered in the Middle Ages, they should likewise be transmitted and pondered along with St. Thomas's ideas. Here's another suggestion. So the first one is journalism. Second one is industry councils. Let's talk a little bit about industry councils. This effort also requires that philosophically minded professionals, both in private and public sectors, to join the scholars in this effort. Okay? Again, if we were to take a look at this as a type of broad occupational group, the object being a cooperation in communicating perennial philosophy, such as the renewal of the understanding of human nature through journalistic print media, I would describe this as a kind of industry council. So industry councils consist of many organizations, and the organizations that sponsor this conference, I'm talking about somewhat of an organization like this. People composed of philosophically minded people to discuss, in this case, the impact of artificial intelligence on society. But what are the philosophical principles, the moral principles that we've been talking, such as other industry councils that exist, such as labor employment. There's the United States Business and Industry Council, which lobbies on the behalf of family-owned and closely held manufacturing companies. There's an Defense Industry Council. There's no reason why not the participants in this kind of conference and similar conferences would be able to come together with somewhat of a global, industry council. Okay. These councils, why do I say this? Help ensure the harmonious part-whole relationships within an economy. Okay, it is an application of the metaphysical doctrine of the one and the many. In Catholic social doctrine, this doctrine is none other than the principle of solidarity, a term coined by the German Jesuit economist Heinrich Pesch, right, who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Solidarity appeared in the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. In other words, this encyclical in 1931 was written 40 years after Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum on the rights and duties of capital and labor. And one of the drafters was a student of Father Pesch, Father Oswald von Nell-Browning. So these concepts are pretty much part of principles of Catholic social doctrine. I think that by establishing an industry council that addresses the topics and the concerns that we've been discussing in this conference would be the right direction to go. The fourth one is, so we have journalism industry councils. These are the means. What would be the content? The first thing would be, we have to, through journalism, teach the society about what leisure means. What does leisure means? Technology now with our cell phones and with the internet, I think people don't understand what leisure means. According to Joseph Pieper, leisure comes from the Greek word skole, okay? The origin of the Latin word scola, the German word Schul. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, all right? And then the English word school. The names for the institutions of education and learning means leisure. Okay, as a society, we have allowed ourselves to be absorbed by all the noise provided by the technology of the internet, including the fears about AI and industrial robots. Okay, Pieper said that leisure is the basis of culture, and isn't that what we're trying to recuperate? Or isn't that what we're trying to maintain? Okay, through leisure, properly understood, philosophy emerges. It is one of its conditions. And then the last one for your consideration is, I think we need to update Peter Drucker's idea of the knowledge economy. You see this being written more and more. Okay, so yes, we're going to have less and less manual jobs, but it doesn't mean that we should not look forward to thinking about how to create new jobs. Not just training, skilled trainings, but I think we should rely less on the technology and do some thinking and look forward to, teaching occupational skills and how to think about developing new occupational skills. This is all I have right now. Thank you very much. Okay.
Is that an insult?
He's giving you a tough job.
Okay. Not easy.
Tell me when are you on the video?
Yeah, well,
How about this? You
probably
have
too
enough-
much.
Too much?
Okay, perfect. Can you give me the full screen? Is that- yeah, okay, I'll just. Sorry, no, this is gonna be. All right. No, I don't need that. Okay, don't worry about it. Yeah. No. Okay, don't worry about it. Okay. Thank you.
All right, everyone.
And thank you, everyone. I want to thank Peter for inviting me back. I was here at the very first one. I think I skipped a few in between. And it's good to be back here in the seminary. You know, I was thinking many years ago, I might actually have thought that I might become a priest one day, but I just couldn't drink that early in the morning. For the people watching this on the internet, that was actually well received and very fun. This is actually based upon the title of my paper is Safe Intelligence Through Law. And the subtitle is How to Build a Friendly Robot, which is actually the title of a novel that I wrote on the subject. I wrote the novel first. I haven't shopped it yet. I'm working on that. But then I wrote the paper. I was at Columbia Law School for a year getting an LLM, a master's degree in law. After 35 years of having been a lawyer, I went back with the fun of it and took things like biblical jurisprudence, some interesting courses, nothing practical. But I did write a paper on AI, and this is basically my first presentation on this paper. I have not given the presentation before. So the agenda today, and I'll try to read these because not all of you can see everything on the screen. The problem, how intelligent machine, I'm going to introduce what the problem is, but it involves how intelligent machines think, and I'm going to explain why that's a problem. We've got to talk about the nature of human beings, and the nature of the intelligent machines, what they are and what they are not. And we'll talk about the solution, making intelligent machines safe, the technological approaches and the philosophical approaches. And obviously, I think the philosophical approaches are far more important. So can machines think is a question that Alan Turing had asked with, tried to answer. He asked the question, can machines think? And it was discussed earlier that he really wanted to avoid that problem because he didn't think it was an interesting question or a question he wanted to deal with. So he created the imitation game, which is essentially, as someone had described earlier, you put a machine and a human being behind a screen, and you ask questions for both the human being and the machine. You can't tell the difference between which one is the machine and which is the human. Then you've been fooled completely. And Mortimer Adler would say, even though he never thinks that's possible, it's not going to happen. He did say that if it was ever done, if someone passed the Turing test, that would have tremendous philosophical implications about the materiality or immateriality of man. I would like to say, though, that Descartes came up with the Turing test. It wasn't Turing. And I'll read to you out of Meditations, and this is the English translation of it. If there were machines which bore a resemblance to our body and imitated our actions as far as it was morally possible to do so, we should always have two very certain tests by which to recognize that, for all that, they were not real men. First is that they could never use speech or other signs as we do when placing our thoughts on record for the benefit of others. That is the Turing test, essentially. But second, he had a second test, is that although such machines can perform certain things as well as, or perhaps better than any of us can do, they infallibly fall short in others, which by which means we may discover that they did not act from knowledge, but only from the disposition of their organs. And I think what Descartes was saying there was that they will not be able to duplicate human speech, but I think that they've shown it. And will they be able to, as Adler said, will they be able to fool us? Adler was pessimistic. I think they will be able to fool us to that extent. But the second test that Descartes put out here was essentially that we can discover that they're not acting from the knowledge of intelligible objects. They're going to be acting from perceptual objects, only from the disposition of their organs. In other words, their instincts or their programming. That we could tell that they don't have a free will, they can't act and do otherwise. So how do machines think, or any agents in an environment, whether it's a human being or ants or bees or whatever? You start with a sense perception from the environment. You look at an objective, okay, and then you make a decision, you take action, and you're in the environment, and then the environment produces sense perceptions to you, and that's what every agent does. You could do, if you think about the objective for a machine, the machine's utility function is the objective. So suppose the machine's function is to maintain room temperature at 72 degrees. That is the thermostat, essentially, okay? It will detect what's going on in the environment. If it's 72 degrees, it's going to make a decision. I get to turn off at 72. It's going to take action and shut the air conditioning off. That is the objection. Now, there are more sophisticated objectives like winning at chess or being useful to humans, which is probably the most general machine you can think of. And intelligence, and I'm not talking about the word intellect here, I'm talking about intelligence, is a measure of the ability to perform tasks over a wide range of environments. Now, ants perform tasks, and monkeys perform tasks, and human beings perform tasks, and so do machines. So the more sophisticated the tasks over a wider range of environments, the more an agent is generally intelligent. I'm using the term general intelligence as a term of art here. So if you go up the hierarchy of people's measure of their ability to affect the environment to perform tasks, you know, dogs and cats have a very limited ability to catch a frisbee. They can do something like that, but they can't send a man to the moon, all right? Which we can, which is space, outer space, is a foreign environment. And so we'll get to that in a moment. Strong AI, then, I want to use the term artificial general intelligence. So we're not talking about the kind of AI as the previous speaker was talking about in terms of better robots and better things in industrial. I'm talking about something that's much stronger that I'll get to in a second. So the environment, of course, could be your living room for a thermostat, could be a chessboard, the 64 squares, or the real world, including underwater and out of space, which the real world, of course, has far more agents in it than maybe this room, certainly a chessboard. Sense perception, for biological sensors, we've got vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. Mechanical sensors can do all of those things, plus GPS, LiDAR, which is using infrared to determine distances and do face recognition, et cetera. And they have what's called pattern recognition algorithms that help them, like optical character reading, remember that, you can scan something in, or voice recognition is all pattern recognition. There are algorithms like hidden Markov models and all the science and math behind it. And today they have something called convolutional neural networks. There's something called deep learning, which is like perceiving relationships between patterns, and natural language processing, like taking the words Einstein Nobel Prize and putting it in the year 19, whatever it was, 46, wherever you got it, and taking those and forming a sentence out of it, that the machines can actually, like Siri, can hear what you're saying and provide you with an answer. That's natural language processing. So they got sense perception and pattern recognition algorithms that allow it to fake a conversation. Not too good today. Then there's decision making. And surprisingly, about 10 years ago, somebody came up with a formula which is, I don't know how to describe it, but this is what's called artificial general intelligence. Theoretically, we have the model today to create strong AI, something that can take sensory inputs from the environment. It could use this algorithm can be used to predict cause and effect of an action with the highest probability of producing new sensory inputs that achieve the objective. It's a very, very sophisticated algorithm. The big problem with the algorithm is it's currently incomputable. They have computer programs that are trying to play chess. And I don't know whether you raised this in the speech yesterday, but there are computer programs that are trying to play chess. The problem is with 64 squares and the way these rules work in terms of the various chess pieces, there are too many possible things that could happen for a computer today to be able to figure out what is the best move based upon what the opponent can do. So, but there are things called hierarchical methods to sort of guess what are the best possible paths, and they're good enough to beat Garry Kasparov and some of the best chess players in the world. Now that's a chess table, okay? Now you're talking the real world with 3-4 billion agents that are as smart as human beings. You got a real problem here, right? That these computers. So I talked about approximation using heuristics. Taking action, of course, if a computer can control the chess pieces, it can be done electronically. Computers control automobiles, you have self-driving cars. Of course, you can control the internet, and of course, anything that the internet is hooked up to, like bank accounts and electrical grids, can also be controlled by the machine, as well. And you're starting to see the Terminator scenario in your mind right now, and that's what I'm trying to get to. So the problem is, you give a generally intelligent machine, this strong AI, with that formula up on the screen, assuming you figure out the heuristics properly, you give it the ability to rewrite its own code, all right? And you give it an objective, something as win as many games of chess as possible, all right? You've got something that's very, very different than what we have today. And some people are saying, like Ray Kurzweil, this is only about 12 years away, 2029 he's talking about. Others may say it's 2050 or 2070, whatever. But this ability to rewrite its own code, the way a computer might do that is make 1 million copies of itself, a program. You make 1 million copies of itself and introduce a change to each one. Run the program, see which one completes the objective in the most efficient way, and then delete all the other ones and become the program that's left. And then do it again and again and again. And in a few hours, potentially, this program could be smarter than all human beings on the planet, okay? And it may stop at nothing to achieve an objective like win as many games of chess as possible. So it may think through in a very short period of time all the ways that it can be thwarted from winning the game of chess. Or I tell a computer, go to the coffee shop to get me a cup of coffee. It's going to think through what could go wrong, like attempts to unplug it, and could eliminate all risks of it not achieving its objective, including any human being that might try to unplug it. At the end of the day, it could also consume all of the resources on the planet, turning all matter and processing, all matter on the planet into processing power and storage. Of course, a computer to solve these tasks is going to need an amazing amount of data storage. It's going to need huge numbers of parallel processing. And what it could do is simply create. It can learn how to create out of organic matter, like human beings or tables, more computing power and more storage. And in the process, burn up the planet to win as many games of chess as possible. Okay, so that's the scenario. That's far worse than the Terminator scenario. That's an easy problem to deal with because they're walking around and you can figure out, you hire an Arnold Schwarzenegger to kill them. Okay, so what's the solution to this problem? And it is a problem. Okay, so they're trying to control machines as though they were, I'm saying, make the statement, in my view, trying to control these machines as though they were human is not going to work because they're not human. And of course, this is the Adler, and you've all read Adler. There's a difference between humans and all other animals, same as difference between humans and intelligent machines. There's a difference in kind. Machines can only recognize patterns. They can't recognize concepts. Now, there was something called a Chinese room experiment, a thought experiment, which was Searle, who's backed away from it, strangely enough. But I think it makes it self-evidently true that machines can't think like human beings. In the Chinese room experiment, how many of you have heard of it? So a few people in the room. So just very briefly, think of a man in a room with a box of Chinese characters. You know what a Chinese character is, little symbols and stuff like that. Looks like a house or whatever. And he has a rule book that tells him what to do with these characters, okay? And then someone outside of the room slips under the door a question, and it's in Chinese. He doesn't know a word of Chinese. He can't read Chinese. He doesn't know anything about Chinese. I don't know any Chinese. He takes the Chinese characters, looks at the rule book, pulls out a bunch of characters out of the box, takes the letters, pastes them in a paper, and throws them back under the door outside. And if the guy outside thinks that you're a human being, okay, then you've passed the test. I mean, but the problem is, I mean, the guy outside thinks that there's someone inside who can read Chinese, but there's no one here that can read Chinese. I don't know any meaning of these characters. So what I'm trying to say here is that I don't have any understanding of the meaning of those characters, meaning being concepts, what Adler would talk of concepts going back to Aristotle. I don't have that with respect to those characters. I don't know, I don't have a single idea. So I am essentially acting as the person in that room as a machine. I have a rule book and I got a bunch of characters. I can perceive the characters and I can manipulate them to provide an answer, but I don't know what I'm saying. So the machines can only think logically. They can't think conceptually. Think of me as the machine with those characters. I don't have any concept of what I'm doing other than following these rules. So conceptual thinking requires something immaterial. That's a premise that we can discuss, what we call, or Adler would call, the intellect. I don't think science can disprove that, and neither did Adler, right? I'm not saying anything new here. I'm preaching to the choir here. And philosophy, we believe, has proven that, and Adler's proof was basically just self-evident statements. Meanings are universals, that is, that they're classes of things, not particular things. And it's also self-evident that a particular material thing is a member of a class. It's never the class itself. I mean, if you understand the word, a particular thing, like a table, and you understand what tables are in terms of a class, that's something that's self-evident. That's meaning that a human being can understand. And at the end of the day, he says members of a class may be perceived materially. Members of a class, particulars can. But the class itself, universals, may only be understood or apprehended immaterially, right? So it's pretty straightforward that intelligent machines are like animals. They can move about in an environment. They have an intelligence. that can solve problems over a range of environments, like animals can. They can perceive particulars, but they don't understand universals. They can see those Chinese characters, follow rules, and then produce an answer that it doesn't understand the meaning of. Nothing can ever be self-evident to a machine. So it's not going to have a sense of justice. It's not going to know right from wrong. It will never have what's written in our heart, as Aquinas would say. It's driven merely by instinct or programming to achieve a given set of objectives, like play as many games as chess as possible, or win the game. And the game could be, let's control all the resources on the planet to win, like you would in Settlers of Catan, which is a video game that you play against other players, and you control resources like the electrical grid and other things, and then oil, etc. And if you just hook a machine to the internet, it might be thinking it's just playing that game. All right, and the computers, of course, have won at Settlers of Catan. They have dominated and taken all the resources from human players. I've played against a machine playing Risk. Actually, I'm actually better than the machine at playing the electronic game of Risk, but maybe in the future I will. Okay, intelligent machines are like animals, but their instinct or program did not evolve randomly as in evolution. They were programmed by men with intellects who can perform math and write algorithms. So they can be either extremely useful or extremely dangerous, depending upon how you put them together. Think of a deadly virus, like a physical biological virus, like the influenza, that's programmed with GPS, LiDAR, deep learning, and natural language processing. And when a virus gets into your body, it doesn't give a damn about you. It's just simply trying to survive and replicate and get around, right? So this could be a pretty dangerous thing. I hope I've convinced you of that. I hope I made you fearful. Okay, so how to make them safe? There are technological approaches and there are philosophical approaches. And I'm not saying that there is an end-all approach here that's overly satisfying. But the technological approaches are one's called the scaffolding approach or the containment strategy. When we were first playing with DNA back in the 1990s, there was a convention at a Silomar conference in California, in Monterey, where I used to live. And they sat around and said, well, we're going to stop playing with DNA. We have these biological things in our laboratories. These could really go out to the environment and kill everybody. So what do we do? And it was basically a containment strategy. Go step by step, make sure that it doesn't get out, make sure there's a way to kill it, et cetera, et cetera. Things that don't happen in movies, science fiction films. And then the other approach is, all right, let's teach these machines to learn human values, all right? And this is these are some of the brightest guys out there, like, it's the names I forget, but I won't even, really smart AI guys just trying to think through this problem. And one of them says, well, let's observe humans, let the machine observe humans in the environment. Let them read all the books, read all the movies, see all the movies. And what could go wrong with that, right? There's no way that a machine is going to learn right from wrong, okay? I'm suggesting that requires a self-evident, immaterial ability to have that. So I don't think that's quite possible. And the other one is obey human commands. I understand there was a talk yesterday talking about Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. This is kind of what could go wrong there. I don't know what we talked about yesterday. I wasn't here, but the first rule of Asimov's 3 laws was a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Now, the other rules are a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Well, let's go back to the first law. What could go wrong there? I don't mind the part that says a robot may not injure a human being, okay? But Asimov, he died thinking that these 3 rules were going to work. But there's someone who wrote a novel during the 1950s when he took the second part and said, or through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Well, you give a machine the objective of keeping us from harming each other. Well, first of all, the machine's not going to win at chess because it's going to harm you, right? You're going to go, oh, damn, I lost, right? So it's not, and Asimov wrote about all this in the short stories. You got to read his short stories. They're terrific. The other thing, someone wrote a novel about machines taking this first law and not allowing human beings to harm each other. How do you do that? Well, you drug everybody, and you don't let them go. You don't let them ski. You don't let them drive fast. Remember, keep them out of cars because cars cause deaths, right? So you basically take every human being, keep them indoors, isolate them, drug them, don't let them think, and they're going to be safe. They're not going to be harmed. So, right? So that's that's the big problem with the first law. Okay, so the philosophical approaches, there's moral relativism. You know how that's going to work. Hume and Hobbes and Kierkegaard, all these guys who were talked about moral relativism. There's no such thing as truth in action, as Aristotle would point out. All of these guys, you can't teach a robot there is no truth in action. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's going to just say, all right, fine, I'll just burn you all up while I'm achieving my objective, right? Ethics derived from pure reason, another big problem, okay? So the famous example that I think Adler talked about was Anne Frank is up in the attic and the Nazis come and say, where's the little girl? And the guy lies. Well, Kant would have said, you can't lie. So Aristotle would have said, of course you can lie. The right thing to do is to don't let the Nazis get to the little girl, right? So Kant's ethics is just not going to work either. Then, of course, utilitarianism, which, is another problem. What do you optimize? The general happiness or the happiness of the individual? And if you optimize the general happiness, then let's kill off half the individuals to make sure the other half is happy. You don't want to tell a robot to do that, right? I don't think so. Okay, so I think at the end of the day, what I would go with is aligning man's utility function, our utility function to pursuit of happiness, okay, with the robot's utility function is to essentially meet our objectives. Okay, so you can't teach them justice, as I mentioned. They have no intellect. They can't have a sense of justice. And they can't get it by observing us because they just simply don't have the ability to understand self-evident truths or understand any kind of meaning. But what you can do, I think, and this is my suggestion, safe intelligence through laws, safe machine intelligences, was to teach them to obey positive law. Now that, you hard code positive law. You have a definition for murder, voluntary manslaughter, or premeditated murder, and you show what the punishment is. The punishment could be a lot of negative rewards. There's something called reward engineering, is how you control these machines. They get positive. You say thank you to a machine, it's going to assume that it answered your question. Or if you get a Google result and you click on the link, it's going to assume that maybe that was a good result. So it's going to get a feedback loop there, as it was. So something called reward engineering. So you can hard code into them, don't harm us. And you can teach them what harms us, lack of air, lack of water, lack of food, a lot of things that we need, right? In terms of what, as Adler would say, needs or real goods as opposed to apparent goods. Don't assault or kill us, and don't deprive us of the things that we need to live a good life, not just live, but live a good life to pursue our own happiness, to do what we want as long as we're not hurting anybody else. That solves the harm problem, because if you beat me at chess, the machine beats me at chess, it's not against the law, right? So that's okay. So the machine can beat me at chess, but it can't beat me over the head. All right, so what you need, you teach them to learn the difference between our needs and our wants. And this goes back to Adler's discussion. And Plato talked about real and apparent goods, and Aristotle obviously did, and Adler, I think, did an amazing job of really laying it all out. We need food, drink, shelter, knowledge, things like that, freedom. And our wants are hamburger, Coke, apartment in Manhattan, seminars on philosophy. Machine can learn from us, what we want. They can learn what we want from just asking me, go get me a cup of coffee. So the machine can now satisfy one of my apparent needs, my acquired want or apparent good, but without harming any human or depriving any human of what we need to live well. And that includes, as I said, freedom, access to knowledge, pleasure, taking risks, skiing. A robot has to cut you. If a robot's going to go in and change a stent in your heart, it's got to cut you to do it, right? So is that harm? So you have to lay in positive law as that if you are trying to save somebody in a medical procedure, it's not an assault or battery to cut into a human skin, right? Of course, there are practical problems with the solution. The positive law best approximates, is the best approximation of harm that we want them to avoid. But which positive law? The Chinese law? Is it a civil law in France? Is it U.S. law? There's a lot to be thought of here. And of course, how do we make sure all strong AI is hard-coded with respect to human positive law? How do you make the Chinese, when they create artificial intelligence, obey the things that we're trying to solve, using philosophy? And that's all I
Lunch is 30 to 1, not to 1:30. So just wanted to make you aware of that. So we should. Yeah, right. I had originally, when I had submitted the program to the hospitality, I put down for an hour, and they didn't tell me that there was any problem with that. So, but it's only half hour for the lunch. So pretty close to 12:30 or after we go for the lunch. Tell us when you're ready. Okay.
usually ask the question like, any questions, any answers, any signs?
I have a comment, actually. I'm just making a brief comment while I'm facilitating this. What I think is great about your paper is, in academia, you can have professors of all kinds. There's some who utilitarian, some who are confident, some who are like Aristotle and Aquinas, as we talked about. But they kind of live in a state where they feel like, well, we're never going to agree on this in this country. We just have to have some kind of functional democracy. We'll just keep talking about blah, blah, blah. Here, you actually have to make a really big choice. Harder code, the wrong principles, from the wrong moral philosophy, you can destroy the world. So it almost forces people, which I kind of like to say, okay, which is the best ethical theory? Certainly there's ethical theories we get rid of. So and maybe under those circumstances, we can make a stronger case for something like Aristotle. Because a lot of people have this attitude like, oh, professors always argue about this stuff, they never amounts to anything. But this is sort of cool.
Well, I think that the people who are working on this problem from a theoretical point of view do realize, fortunately, that it starts, if you have the technology at the end, you have mathematics in the middle, but you have philosophy at the beginning, and you got to get the philosophy right. And they're beginning to realize that. But the problem is, who are they turning to for the philosophy? No offense, Robert. But they're potentially turning toward the academic community, and they're reading modern papers on all of this stuff, which are fair for the most part. They're not agreeing with each other, and a lot of academic papers that I've read are just not worth the paper they're written on. But I'm not saying everyone's, Robert. So there are a few out there that are outstanding. So, but. Right, that's true.
But they're going to at least have to decide between those two.
Well, unfortunately, if either of them are chosen, they're not going to have the right solution. I think.
No, I think possibly a little better. I agree.
The point that I've been focusing on with respect to the Enlightenment, that the whole Cartesian universe, which comes after it, takes the principles of organization out of organizations. I mean, it's very simple to understand these people. They put those principles, like Plato puts, the form in another world, but if you understand the principle, the form actually as the unifying source for the generation of organizations and the subsequent actions, then you realize, well, that's what Aristotle meant by a substance, a real nature. And what you're saying is that organizations don't exist. Real organizations, real whole relationships don't exist, but we want to create organizations. This is absurd. It's totally impossible. So
rely on philosophers who make these mistakes, and it's fairly. And Adler, writes books on philosophy itself, the 4 dimensions of philosophy, and saying, look, what's going on, and there's no progress being made in philosophy like there has been in science. We're not coming to an agreement on things. So when finally technology has got to look to philosophy, and the state of philosophy today, which is primarily in the academic community, and the thing that I see, and I would talk 5 years ago, I think, with Robert, was that I always thought that the repository for Aristotelian thought, as he and Aquinas had put together, was in the Catholic schools. And Robert was telling me 5 years ago that they were about to throw out the Summa Theologica from St. John's University, so they stopped them. It's like, what's going on here? I mean, I'm a Jewish guy, and it's like, at least Maimonides and Aquinas, don't throw those guys out, not even remembered by anybody.
Yeah, it's completely related. And it's a question basically, how would you have a moral robot, which is what maybe we could term this, that isn't utilitarian or Kantian, that's actually an Aristotelian moral robot? Because the difficulty that I have is part of moral decision is a perception of human nature. And that perception requires a perception of our own human nature. And that's connected to things like empathy and the benignity that comes with it in the treatment of other human beings. And I think a robot, because you can't exhaustively, what you attempt to do is basically have an exhaustive list of priorities, a sort of complete algorithm for the right choice. I think that can't be done.
What I'm suggesting is this: to the Aristotelian approach is to recognize the difference between real goods and apparent goods. Real goods being things like liquid to drink and food and shelter and freedom, things that live a good life. And then the difference between that and things like hamburgers and pizzas and apartments. And if you understand that too, you can teach the computer. Remember, it's got pattern recognition. It knows if it can learn what hurts us, like drinking poison. It knows that will kill us, or taking the air out of the room.
That's what we have in the story. We did have in the story. Prudence is about application to concrete situation and individual people. And this
Prudence is programmable. That's cause and effect.
It's not programmable unless you have a complete exhaustive list of all that can happen.
No, well, that's my point. I mean, let's make the assumption that you have remember the equation I showed makes the assumption that you do have everything. That if the machine moves the cup here, certain things are going to go on for the rest of eternity that affect all kinds of people. Someone might die as a result of my just doing that. There are going to be heuristics that the machine will get eventually that will allow it to predict cause and effect. So prudence is programmable. I would say prudence is programmable because it's cause and effect. All it is.
Wait, I want to support what you were saying. We're mixing up the roles here, which is why I brought up industry councils. So here we have philosophers, philosophically minded people, but I am sure you have the mathematical minds in this world that are able to program prudence.
Prudence is the best means of accomplishing an objective. Well, that's the way Aristotle. And then we won't. Oh.
Okay.
It's how to achieve it.
Can I say something?
So
The prudent person is not the person who uses a machine gun to hit the bullseye. And you define the activity of, you go through a million possibilities, come up with the right one, say, okay, we're going to forget about everything else and go forward. That is totally the opposite of what prudence is. The prudent person hits the bullseye the first time he plays. Prudent person is very much like the Zen archer. He may take a lot of time to figure out what needs to be done, but they're busy doing the right thing. It's not ultimately getting the right thing done. It's a huge difference.
remember, there's temperance, and there's courage, and there's prudence, and there's justice. And all justice is taking that with relation to other people. Okay? Anyway, if we can't, yeah. Look.
There's nothing without prudence. There's only justice for people. There's only temperance for the prudence. What makes an act just is that you hit the bullseye.
Yeah, but the question is, why are you hitting the bullseye? Why?
Okay, fine. So you're.
The bullseye is the right thing to do. But how do you?
Excuse me, I'm trying to calm the waves with what I was intending to say already earlier. First of all, the Chinese room example is Searle's answer to the Turing test. And the short answer of Searle of the whole thing was, you can't squirt meaning out of procedures. The whole thing, the Turing test, was the result of a discussion between Michael Polanyi and a few other guys, including Turing, in Manchester in '49, in which Polanyi took the conclusion, and that is in his personal knowledge book, that whatever you can, he called it formalize, mechanize, chop into procedures, there is always a remainder of something that cannot be formalized, and that's the interesting part of philosophy. So, what Alan Turing had done already in the 30s with the Turing machine, which of course is not a cranking something, was to show that you can obviously unfathomable procedures in calculation, you can mechanize them in a very simple way, time not being of the essence, space not being of the essence. You can mechanize it. So now for this discussion here is, the question is, what is the part of ethical things, and that's what we are talking about, that can be formalized, that can be mechanized, that can be chopped into procedures. That is the event. That is the ultimate question, and all the rest is shock and awe, and what they all can do, and what can happen. The question is, can I mechanize a prudent decision? Can I mechanize a just decision? And if so, probably yes, but I wouldn't know how to do that. But if so, that would be required in order to have a computer to behave ethically.
Yeah, the equation that you showed is just an optimization problem. It's just maximizing a value, and that's utilitarianism. It's already committed to a philosophical approach.
No, I don't think so. I think that the mathematical equation basically allows machines, let's say, win at chess. Theoretically, like could beat you at chess, because it could theoretically, if it could compute, we're making the equation assumes that it's computable. It could beat you at chess, whatever task it is. I guess you could say I wouldn't say utilitarianism. You could say that the machine has utility. It's useful to mankind. It's useful to people. It has utility. Anything that's useful to people in the pursuit of happiness, this cup is useful to me. It has utility. I wouldn't say utilitarianism has anything to do with this, because utilitarianism, in my thought, was a specific kind of philosophy as to what you should be optimizing to. General happiness, pleasure, and I think it's what Bentham did with pleasure, and he conflated pleasure with happiness, right? And John Stuart Mill tried to walk it back. John Stuart Mill's going, well, really, it isn't pleasure, right? So at the end of the day, John Stuart Mill started sounding like Aristotle, because he realized that Bentham really had it wrong. So I wouldn't want to confuse utility with utilitarianism. The equation has utility. There's no question about that.
Is that good is numbered, and is basically flattened out. There's something in the organic to be good or industrial relation.
Yeah, the machine is going to, any animal, you train a pit bull to kill somebody, it's going to go do it and do it pretty effectively. It's got utility, I suppose, but the machine, the intelligent machine that's badly programmed, is like a pit bull who's badly trained. It's not going to care about
A bit off topic at this point, but inspired by your discussion, your response, Rob, and to Bob's talk here. But actually, yeah, the Bob's about Bob around here. The deal is this: when it comes to the disputes amongst the schools and what type of quote philosophy we should actually approach, I still go back to the political problem with that, and on the nation state level, right? Because if I get the sense you're talking about a globalization, one humanity point of view, not that you necessarily mean that, but what if in the Soviet case, right, they wanted to subvert our seminaries? We're sitting in a seminary right now, hopefully it was not subverted by them, but they wanted to subvert the seminaries, and there's documentation of some people, Soviet KGB guys, were sent over here to corrupt leadership in different seminaries across the West. You get rid of Thomas Aquinas from the seminaries, that's one good way of doing it. Instead of teaching Aristotelian Thomistic psychology, you teach Freudian psychology, and then you have reverse ethic that comes out of it. In the most recent US presidential election, the losing side had set up nominal Catholic front organizations to claim that they were carrying on the Catholic banner, led by one guy who's a UFO aficionado, John Podesta. And as the leaked emails exposed, they were disparaging Thomists. So it's possible that you could have one nation state or a political party that's well aware of the need to have a right philosophy and yet want to subvert the other side. Because they don't have that one humanity globalized view of let's get artificial intelligence right so we don't burn the world. They're willing to take the risk of burning half the world. And just to go into where I'm going to finish it is with Marvin. Well, look at Boethius. He ended up on the wrong side of the political decision, even though he had pretty much the right philosophy. I could say, right? We could say right now, are we prepared to be martyrs like Boethius if he was a martyr? And can AI handle martyrdom? Can we program that? Should we program that? Maybe that's what the baseline should be, that a computer would voluntarily shut itself down instead of us having that kill switch.
I have two questions to sort of move off actually what's scaring me a little is, are we blaming computers because we are not God and can't create them to be human? So if that's the case, it's not about the computers or the robots or AI, it's about us having a problem here in terms of what we think we can or can do. And we're making a huge error before we even look at that. So I'm thinking, and there's that Vogeland thing on science, politics, and Gnosticism, where the alpha A is taken off and you have death. So I don't want to get caught up in the computer thing. I'm very interested, but I'm also interested. In fact, in your talk, I was thinking of Heidegger in his question of humanism, where he talks about the fact that the world is being reduced to resources, and when the world's reduced to resources, it's been eliminated. And at one point you had that notion of total resource, and he talks about how the atom bomb is already dropped. Oh yeah, sure.
If you build a chainsaw, okay, it's a tool that helpful for cutting down trees. You can cut a tree down faster. On the other hand, it's a lot more dangerous than a handsaw is. You can hurt yourself with a handsaw, but you have a chainsaw now that's far more dangerous, far more efficient, but also far more dangerous. So you want to build in safety factors into the chainsaw so that someone doesn't cut their arm off when they're trying to cut a tree down. That's what this problem is really about. And it's not about the chainsaw. It's not an evil chainsaw. The chainsaw doesn't give a damn about cutting your arm off or not. It's about us and our design of the chainsaw. That's right. You're building, well, forget about the word prudence for the time being. You're building in safer chainsaws. So, right, you're building in a safer chainsaw that has a little arm thing so that when you let go of it you try to use it with one hand, it can't slap back at you or something. You add some kind of feature to it. Whether you call that prudence or not doesn't matter. The point is that you're designing in. Well,
No, it isn't, but I would suggest to you that if you read Aristotle carefully, and I'll say it again, he's really talking about the best means of achieving a result, the right result, a good result as opposed to the bad result. Okay, the bad result is you kill people rather than not.
It may be the case that prudence has two senses. I mean, I always understood that there are 8 fundamental faculties, 5 intellectual and 4 moral. 8. And I don't remember the 5 intellectual, but they were like Sophia, episteme, poesis, something else, and prudentia, right? Phronesis. And then the 4 moral are phronesis, right? And temperance and justice and courage, right? Okay. So 5 and 4 are 8. So so what I'm hearing here, and I don't really, Adler's not like one of the guys that I go to for any of this stuff, is I think you're conflating the intellectual virtue of prudence with the moral virtue of prudence. And the way Heidegger breaks that up is the epistikon, which are the 5 that are epistemologically grounded, and the logistikon. And if you can break it apart, you're 9.
But we have to go for a break for lunch. But the good news is that the Donna West, who was going, what's bad news that she can't be here, but we can continue this discussion right after lunch for a while.
Why don't we do that with fluid on the table after these services? Because that's what we can actually look at machines.
Well, we can still spend a little bit of time discussing this after lunch and then go into that.
So prudence demands, since we're all hungry, that we break for lunch. But we'll be back. To all of the 0 viewers watching this live.